Now we're going to talk about manuscript illumination in the 5th and 6th centuries. These are the earliest surviving classical and biblical illustrated books. Manuscripts are handwritten books until the 15th century, when paper production allowed printed books. All books were handwritten and copied. Relatively few books were illustrated, but when copying an illustrated book, the pictures as well as the text might be copied. This way, images and iconographic types were transmitted. Illustrated manuscripts are called illuminated manuscripts, and the painted images in manuscripts are often called miniatures. Now, sometimes people think of that because, oh, they're illuminated, they're bright with color. But actually, the word comes from the red lead, which was known as minium. And minium was used to write some of the important words, such as the rubrics or the directions or the opening words. So you've heard this term, red letters, the red letter day or something. If you had a list of, let's say, saints' days, and they might be picked out in red. So the minium gives us the word illuminated. And now, something else I should tell you about is that the abbreviation for manuscript in English, or in French also, is MS. And the plural is MSS. If you're reading something in German, it's Handschriften, so it'd be HS would be the manuscript abbreviation. Because of the great losses of manuscripts, art historians often try to determine the lost models of manuscripts and of monumental works such as mosaics. We've already talked about that with Santa Maria Maggiore. Thus, 6th century manuscripts may copy the classical style of late antiquity, and the mosaics on the wall of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome may be copied or derived from an illustrated Bible. So we do spend a good deal of time in class talking about things that do not exist and trying to find evidence in things that do exist. The books in the classical world were written on rolls of Egyptian papyrus. These rolls, or scrolls, or rotuli, and the singular would be rotulus, were not durable except in a dry climate. So we find that the classical texts on papyrus scrolls do not survive. As you probably know, the Alexandrian library was burnt by Julius Caesar and others. During the sack of Rome, we undoubtedly lost more manuscripts. People didn't read them, you know, it's a different language. They probably used them just as trash paper. At any rate, we do not have any original Roman classical texts that survive. All of the Roman literature that we know is because it was copied during the medieval period. So classical Roman texts on papyrus rolls do not survive. Our word Bible comes from the Greek word biblion, and it means a papyrus roll book. So Bible means a book, but the original book form would have been a roll. When the Roman Empire broke up and trade with Egypt ceased, papyrus was no longer available. Animal skin made into parchment or vellum was more durable than papyrus, but costly and difficult to roll and unroll. So a new form of book became dominant. The codex. Codex is a book with leaves or pages. Your textbook is a codex. Mostly today, when we think of a book, we think of a codex. Bound on one side, it has pages you can turn. The origin, they speculate, was probably a diptych coated with wax for taking notes in law courts or anything else you wanted to take notes for. By the 2nd century, Christians used papyrus codices. cheap paper, which could be perhaps distinguished from the pagan roll. But between the 2nd and 4th centuries, rolls and codices were used. In the 4th century, with Christianity the state religion, codices with parchment leaves were probably standard. The use of parchment made it possible to preserve books for centuries. And as I said, what we know of classical literature is because of selective copying by medieval monks and scribes, especially during the Carolingian and Byzantine periods. Few books were illustrated until the later Middle Ages, when wealth increased and literacy extended into the upper middle class of merchants, bankers, and skilled craftsmen. Patrons for illustrated books were usually aristocrats at that time and clergy, and as we'll see, clergy throughout the Middle Ages. It was very costly to produce a manuscript. It took a lot of time. You have to write out the entire text. It took a lot of skill. For one, the scribes, who usually would be monks or nuns, would have, as we get into the medieval period after the fall of Rome, they would have to be literate. They would have to have a very careful letter hand. You know, they couldn't write in a scribbly fashion as much of us do today. They had to be clear. Also, to create these books, you would need many animals' hides to create the parchment. So that would be extremely expensive. You might need a whole herd of animals to create certain books. Pigments were also expensive. So this is a very costly, luxurious thing to do, to create a manuscript and then to illustrate a manuscript. Now, these books are extremely rare. Most of the ones that survive were liturgical books used at liturgical services, the services in the church. And the liturgical books were illustrated to honor God with their beauty, with their labor. And then in the later Middle Ages, when we get to the 14th and 15th century, there's another bestseller, which is the Book of Hours, a devotional book for laity. And some of them contain illuminations, sometimes just a colored initial, sometimes full-page miniatures. And of course, some would have been made just for, like I say, middle-class people. And they would not have had miniatures. But that's much later. We're going back to the beginning now. No classical manuscripts survive from ancient Greece or Rome. I've said that before. The earliest examples of illustrated classical manuscripts are around 400, the early 5th century, to 500, just the turn to the 6th century. And there's 4 of these that are illustrated. One is called the Vatican Virgil. It's in the Vatican Library, and its number is 3225. I guess I should explain that too. They didn't have Dewey Decimal System or Library of Congress system of labeling books. And each library comes up with its own method. Sometimes they just will have a number, if it's a small enough library. Sometimes what they will do is they will have the language. As you see here, this is manuscript Latin 3225. And then they would have these numbered. So there's varying ways that different libraries number their manuscripts. We give the most famous manuscripts names, and sometimes the names vary a little. But if you want to be sure about which one they're talking about, you'd learn the number. And I'm not asking you to know the numbers of manuscripts. That would be a little much. What we're looking at now is a scene from the Vatican Virgil. Some of these other books are found is the Milan Iliad, which is in the Ambrosiana Library in Milan, a manuscript F205. The another Vatican Virgil, essentially. They call it the Codex Romanus, the Virgilius Romanus, which is Vatican Library, be Latin 3867. That one has very crude illustrations, not at all what we would expect for classical illusionism. And then something else we'll be seeing is the Vienna Dioscurides, which is in Vienna in the National Library, and it's in Greek, so it's Greek number 1. So first let's look at the one seen in the Vatican Virgil. We assume that as the texts were copied, the illustrations were probably copied from an earlier manuscript, and so we see some elements of classical illusionistic style here in the death of Dido. Probably know the story. Aeneas stayed some time with her, but when he left her, the queen of Carthage, Dido, committed suicide by going on her to her funeral pyre and lighting it herself. And that's what you see here. She's on this pyre of wood that's been stacked up, and she's reaching over with the torch to light the flames. And her ladies are surrounding her, weeping, lamenting. One of them, you can see, has pulled open the garment. She's rending her garments. Now, I should say something else, too. Remember that this is pigment, so sometimes the pigment has broken off in places, so it looks a little splotchy. Sometimes you're looking clear through to the parchment below, and you have to kind of mentally fill in the lost parts. It is framed. Painting a frame has been created around it. In some of the scenes that show landscapes, you can see a kind of atmospheric landscape. Here you can see that the gestures are very strong, maybe even exaggerated. It has been suggested by Weitzman, who's one of the scholars of these early manuscripts, that perhaps the architectural background could be Roman theater architecture, that these might reflect a theater scene. Certainly we can see that the background is shown as these large stones with the strongly emphasized mortar. And there is a suggestion of space, as though she's placed in a little shallow room. The pyre seems to go back around. We have a roof that goes back into space a bit. The perspective here, however, is schematic. It's a little bit awkward, perhaps, in relation to the figures, but it certainly does suggest that it was copied from a more illusionistic manuscript. One of the questions is, could the sources have been continuous rolls, and they took each scene and then put a frame around them? Or were they codices, as this is? We're now going to look at the Vienna Dioscurides, or Dioscurides, and the title of the book is De Materia Medica, or about medical matters, essentially. It's a medical treatise, and it contains herbal remedies. What we're looking at here is an author page. Very frequently, we believe in classical works, the first page of our frontispiece might be a portrait of the author or a portrait representing the author. We see this, as we'll see in Bible illustrations later on, that the 4 evangelists will begin each of the 4 Gospels. But right here, the author, of course, is Dioscurides. And we have a personification of a woman standing opposite him, holding up a mandrake plant. And the figure, I would have called her the muse, or the personification of something, but it is labeled. It is labeled discovery. So he is discovering the effect of the mandrake plant. And presumably she's explaining it to him. And once again, well, Dioscurides has an open book, which he could be writing in, or a reference to the book that's being created here. It does have antique illusionism. You have figures that can turn in space that are somewhat shaded. And throughout this book, here's another scene. We see Dioscurides again. Here he's on the right, and he's concentrating, writing on the open book. And then on the left, we have almost the creation of the book. We have an artist who is drawing the mandrake plant. And this may be a way to show that it's kind of claiming that the illustrations are accurate, that he's actually had an artist do this very carefully. You may notice the elaborate frame, red and gold scroll work going around it. So this certainly is a luxury manuscript. And just to show you a few of the illustrations that actually have to do, they have some zoological drawings in it, some illustrations here of an owl and different types of birds. And then what we might expect in a medical text, botanical images showing different plants and other objects from nature. Here we have a violet, and here we have coral, which was believed to have medicinal and actually almost miraculous powers. What we want to look at now are Christian manuscripts. The earliest extant or existing illustrated Bibles come from the 6th century. We believe that the illustrations, as well as the text, reflect early Christian Bible illustration from the 4th and the 5th centuries. So the images that we're going to look at are from the 6th century, and presumably were copied from earlier manuscripts that are now lost. Our first visual evidence of illustrated Christian Bibles, we've already seen that, the 5th century mosaics in Santa Maria Maggiore. There are only 4 surviving Bible books or parts of books. The entire books do not always survive, that exist from this period, from the 6th century. One is part of a Genesis. And because it's in the Vienna National Library, Codex, Theological Codex, Greek 31, it's known as the Vienna Genesis. And the other 3, we'll look at 2 of them, are the Rossano Gospels, which is in the Cathedral Library in Rossano, Italy. The Sinope Gospel, which is a fragment, and it's in Paris in the Bibliothèque Nationale. It's written in Greek, 1286 if you want to know the number. And we'll also be looking at the Rabula Gospels, which is in Florence in the Bibliothèque Laurentiano, and it is in Syrian or Aramaic, Syrian 5-6, 56. Now, the first 3 that I mentioned are very rich manuscripts. You're looking here, you can see at the Vienna Genesis. They probably had imperial patronage. And we say that because the parchment was dyed purple. You'll notice in reproductions, the purple sometimes looks brown, it sometimes looks red. Evidently, it's a very hard color to photograph. So these are purple manuscripts. The first 3 are large manuscripts, and they have silver letters. Now the silver, of course, has oxidized, so it looks black. And then they have many, many illustrations. The last of those, we'll be talking about those, is the Rabula Gospels, and we actually know where it came from, which was not imperial, it was from a monastery. So we'll be talking about that. The Vienna Genesis dates from the early 6th century. About a quarter of the Genesis text survives. It is a Septuagint. Septuagint means 70. It's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It's called the Septuagint because there were 70 translators. Actually, I've heard that they weren't exactly 70, but approximately 70 translators. So this is a Greek Bible. And you usually wouldn't have a whole Bible in one manuscript. It would be really, really huge, especially if you're going to illustrate it as copiously as this seems to be illustrated. You might have them bound as a single book. You might have them bound in sections, for example, the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And in the 2nd century, before the Christian era, the Septuagint translation was made in Alexandria for the Greek-speaking Jewish community and was believed to have been profusely illustrated by the 2nd century CE. So it may be that this reflects the Septuagint illustrations. As we'll see, they are very illusionistic. But they certainly reflect a lost illustrated Jewish Septuagint illustrations. The text is, for the most part, the text is at the top, but the picture's at the bottom. It's a fragment that has 48 pages. They figured out that it must have originally had 192, just from what's covered on those pages. Most of them have the story of Joseph, and there is a little bit from the story of Isaac and the story of Jacob. So Joseph's father, Jacob, and grandfather, Isaac. One of the interesting things about it is it's a continuous narrative. Let's look at the detail here. You can see that there is a ground line. And we think that this idea of having a kind of continuous narrative going on with the ground lines probably reflects the rotulus tradition. In other words, you'd have a scroll that you could roll out, and these would all be in order on the scroll. But here we have to look at a page, so essentially they've taken 2 sections and put one on top of the other. The brushwork is extremely skillful. It seems to be laid down by someone who is very confident of their skill. There's not a lot of hesitation. And you can see that there is chiaroscuro, there's light and dark shading, very lively gestures. Figures turn in space. They can even run, as you can see. And you have the action telling the story. Now here's the story. You have Potiphar's wife. You may remember that Joseph was sold as a slave by his jealous elder brothers. And he's sent down to Egypt, and he becomes a high servant, a high slave in the household of Potiphar. Unfortunately, I guess well, it works out fortunately in the end. But Joseph is a handsome young man, and Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. And so here you see her on her bed, on her couch, with a wonderful background of a classical arcade that curves around. And she's reaching out, she's trying to grab Joseph. He refuses, and he runs away, but she's able to grab his cape and his cloak. And then she goes to Potiphar, her husband, and says, "Your servant tried to rape me, and here's the proof. I have his cloak here." And of course, Joseph is cast into prison until his ability to interpret dreams has him rescued, and he eventually becomes highest official next to the Pharaoh, advising the Pharaoh, no longer a slave. So here we see Potiphar's wife leaning over. We see the action of Joseph trying to break away. We see other figures, which I assume are I don't know for sure what they are, but they seem to be scenes around the household, perhaps. You know, there's children, there's women spinning, there's women with children. And then I want you to note these little trees that look kind of like umbrellas. I call them umbrella trees. They've got these little twisty trunks. You will actually see their descendants, if you will, in manuscripts from the 9th century, which suggests that they were looking also at early Christian manuscripts. So here we have the illusion of depth, drapery, highlights, shadows. Okay. Now here we have Potiphar's wife accusing Joseph. And you'll notice something. There's figures whose backs are turned to you. There's figures whose sides are turned. So, and of course, the standing figures do seem to have their weight resting on one leg, even when we can't see it. So this really does suggest that you can turn in space. There's not a lot of background. There is that colonnade behind Potiphar's wife in the previous scene. And that suggests a place, like it's happening out inside, and the trees suggest that it's happening outside. And here you see a kind of railing, a little balustrade, with a frame of a doorway, with the figure, his back turned to us, his hand is extending through the doorway. It's cut by the jamb or the frame, but it comes out the other end, so we really see him as being behind the railing and behind this doorway. So the doorway suggests that you're entering into an enclosed space, but he doesn't show it. The purple background, of course, serves as a foil for the brightly colored figures. And here's Potiphar's wife telling her lies and exhibiting, at the lower level, she's exhibiting the garment, the cloak of Joseph as her proof. This has a really interesting ground line. As you can see, it comes around and curves over a bridge and goes back the opposite direction. The brushwork with the atmospheric or impressionistic, very deft brushwork. You're using chiaroscuro to model the figures. And once again, figures turning in space and telling the story. And here we have the close-up view, so you can see these figures moving, going over the bridge. It curves around. You wonder if this was a way of connecting the two sides of the story to show a continuous journey. And then on the lower level, you see Jacob wrestling with the angel. Just showing you a couple of other, we see Noah's Ark, and we also see Rebecca at the well. I don't have these in order, you might notice, of the stories. Rebecca is, of course, the future wife of Isaac. And Abraham is looking for a bride for his son, and so he sends his trusted servant, Eliezer, to go and look for a wife. And Eliezer is like, I've got to find the right woman. So he prays to God as he approaches a settlement. He prays, there's a well, and he says, let the woman who should be the wife of my master's son, when I ask for water, let her also volunteer to give the camels water. In other words, if she's kind to animals, she's probably going to be, well, that's my interpretation. If she's kind to animals, she's probably going to be a good wife. Well, later on. So here we're seeing Eliezer drinking the water, and Rebecca, of course, as we know, gives water to the camels who are there with these wonderful curving necks. They're very graceful looking camels, actually. We see this as settlement. It's actually a walled city. We've seen that kind of city before in the mosaics at Santa Maria Maggiore. We saw the fall of the city of Jericho. This one seems to be a little less constricted. We're looking down and seeing the buildings inside the walled city. And you might notice that we have, well, and we have one of those ground lines that curves over and has the scene continuing on the lower level. And here we have the nymph of the spring. You've probably seen images of Roman river gods with a big urn with the water coming out. The classical idea that these springs were inhabited or personified by lovely young ladies in the nude. So it's a classical motif in a biblical story. And here we see another scene where Eliezer, having decided that Rebecca is the one chosen, he puts bracelets on her arms as gifts, and then of course goes and Rebecca has to check this out with her parents and get permission. So we see them in the little house at the bottom. And you might notice the camel eating from the little tree with the winding trunk.